So on the website, you'll find the code of conduct. We tend to try and run as welcoming and inclusive meetup as we possibly can. On there, you'll find the general standards of behaviour and ways to go about reporting an issue if you have any issues. We also have pages for getting involved with the user group. As you can see, it's quite a labour-intensive event, pulling tracks down, which we didn't think we'd be doing at the start of the year, setting chairs up, drinks, all that sort of stuff. Many hands make light work, as they say, so any and all volunteers are welcome, no matter how big or small. Big thank you as well to everybody who stepped in and helped lay out the chairs tonight too. We also live stream. Wherever my iPad's gone, that's a problem. We do stream these events live. That's what the camera in front of me is here for. And we do record everything and upload everything to our YouTube channel afterwards. You can find the URLs there at the bottom, or they're pinned quite prominently on the website as well. So that's enough community user group business. On to what's coming up. Re-events on this year. Registration is open, tickets are on sale. Anybody thinking of going? Just me? That's alright, more booze in Vegas for me, I don't mind. I know there's quite a few people in the room who will be going. If you haven't been and you're considering it, it's definitely a great way to do it. On the reInvent website as well, they have a lovely explainer that you can give to your boss to try and convince them to pay for your trip. Very handy. But if you can't go all the way to Vegas in December, next month is going to be a very busy month in the AWS cloud space. So we have our scheduled user group on the 28th next month, when the final Wednesday of the month. The very next day we have the Serverless Days conference, and then the following Friday, so 3 days in a row, is the AWS Community Day here in Melbourne. So it's going to be jam-packed August, but well worthwhile. So a bit more info. Registration is open now for the Community Days event. It is hosted here in Melbourne. I think it's at the Convention Centre. Should have checked that before. It is, thank you, cool. Come along to this one, it's a free event, open for everybody. And definitely worth taking a Friday off. We've actually, some of the papers for this have started to come through as well, and now looking really, really good. So definitely worth getting some time off to attend this one. The day before that is the Serverless Days conference on the Thursday, the 29th, over at the museum. Again, I did the same thing I didn't do last month. I looked up the prices or anything like that, so I don't know if it's a free event. I'm going to guess not.
It's not free.
No.
There's also not very.
No. The good thing about Community Day is that Amazon pays for all, so. But unfortunately for independent conferences, it does cost money to run. But definitely still worth checking out, especially if you do work in the serverless space. On the smaller scale of things, the Programming and Tools meetup is on again this month. Is anybody from that event here tonight? No, sometimes they come along. So this is it's a hands-on workshop, it's like a class instructor-led workshop. This month it is a serverless blog with Gatsby and AppSync. If this is of interest to you, bring on a laptop, and yeah, they'll run you through this. Ian's run a few of these as well, so they're generally pretty good. Except when you run them. Yep, sure. Tomorrow night is the serverless meetup. I did see though that the serverless meetup is closed for RSVPs. I think they hit their limit. But there is a wait list, and generally with meetups, only about 50% of people show up. So definitely jump on the wait list if you're interested in this tomorrow night. And then next week is the inaugural Deep Racer Nights event. So this is a local Melbourne tournament run by the guys at eCloud Guru. I think there's some really good prizes available for this and stuff like that. Definitely worth checking out if you're interested in the reinforcement learning aspect. I think that's it. Next week. So I'll get out of the way now. Get Chris and Ian up to do the news.
Cool. Thanks, people, and thanks, Bob, for the introductions. Let's just quickly go through this so that we can have Guy give his wonderful talk. Usually my favorite bit of news is what has finally come to Sydney. It's a bit disappointing this one, sorry.
Nothing new in Sydney.
It's not because everything's here. So we got IoT events and a couple of more exotic instance types that weren't available yet. So I guess we'll move on to the more general news. I've got good news. Personally, this first one on the list, which was announced this very morning, is quite a big one. You can now, with ECS, have multiple target groups and therefore load balancers and therefore ports and all that stuff for a single container task, which solves some issues I've run into in the past. Yeah, I know you don't have anything to say about this section, do you? That's okay. There's a bunch of other things. I'm not going to read out everything that's on here. Another possibly interesting one, although I haven't tried it out yet, is that you can now convert task definitions easily to Docker Compose, so you can more easily run the same thing in the cloud and locally. And actually, container insights, I talked about that last week as well, not here. It allows you to have more deeper insight into your metrics, things like that. It's still in preview. I have no idea how much it's going to cost and if that's worth it, but so judging by the roaring reactions of the crowd, let's move on to the next.
Well, I think this should have been the slide we led with because of the massive announcement that's on here. Corretto. Can I get a yeah? Wow. Okay, we'll try that again. Corretto. Okay, all right, we'll work on that. Corretto is a local favorite, and there's some news. Whenever there's a Corretto item, the Slack goes wild, so please do join. When I say wild, I mean like 5 of us click like. So join the Slack. It's slack.aws.ug.org.au. It's free to sign up, and join the announcements page where you can find out riveting things like the announcement of Amazon Corretto crypto provider. So yeah, join and get more of that.
Everybody loves crypto providers. Yeah. In more boring news then, something called the CDK went live. Yeah, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, pretty cool. So one of the ways that you can build your infrastructure in AWS and deploy your applications is using something called AWS CloudFormation, which is infrastructure as, we've always called it infrastructure as code, but I guess it was really infrastructure as like a config file, because it was either JSON or YAML.
I know. I never understood why anybody would use JSON.
Shush you out. I'm afraid our next talk is cancelled because of the YAML heckling. But now AWS, there's a tool called the CDK, which allows you to write basically CloudFormation, but as code. So it really now is infrastructure as code, so you can inherit things, you can modify things, and you can just write it all as code. You can do for loops, so you don't need to copy paste anymore. Absolutely fantastic, and it is now GA, which means it's more stable. So please do go check that out. It's on the GitHubs, it's everywhere. Yeah, do go check that one out. It's going to be a real game changer for those of us wanting to write infrastructure as code. We now can. It's really cool.
If you say so. Cool. The other one that may be more interesting for people who are in the serverless side of things is the AWS Toolkit for Visual Studio Code, which basically integrates your whole Lambda development into your IDE, which is also pretty cool. So, databases. Everybody loves databases. DocumentDB, or is it DocumentDB with MongoDB compatibility, as it's really formally known, grew up a little, and you can now actually stop one. But more interesting is probably the serverless Aurora for Postgres.
Yeah, something that a lot of people have been after for a while. So the serverless Aurora has been available for MySQL for a while, but now you can run the Postgres version. So it's a version of Aurora and MySQL that will scale up as demand increases, and it'll also scale back down. And you can even set like an idle timeout, so that if there's no use on it, say you set it for half an hour, after half an hour it goes to sleep, and then you're not paying for the compute while it's asleep. And then as soon as somebody comes in first thing in the morning, they hit the database and they get an error while it's just starting up, and then 60 seconds or whatever it is later, the database starts up and you're off to the races again. So fantastic for your dev test environments. If you're running Postgres MySQL today, have a serious think about dev test environments, switching them over to serverless Aurora. I believe Postgres is still not in Sydney. Should have checked this in advance. I'll get back to you on that one.
Judging by the usual way of things, it was probably released in 4 regions, none of which is Sydney.
I think it might be like the data API or something, so I'll get back to you on that one.
Yeah. So, some other cool stuff, and maybe we should close that window before
guys
talk start. Some event bridge. That's a pretty cool feature. If anybody is familiar with CloudWatch events, which basically means you can have actions like, for example, Lambda functions or anything else triggered by way of things that happen in through AWS API calls. This is the same thing, but for third-party providers. So what this can basically do is, for example, if you have a ticketing system, if a ticket happens, something happens in your AWS account that you can set your own triggers to. You don't have to do much. After initially setting it up, you don't have to do anything on the third-party provider side, but everything is just within your AWS account, how you manage it.
So the next one is huge. So CloudWatch logs insights. So if you're using Lambda functions, they'll automatically be logging out to something called CloudWatch. But if you've got EC2 instances, you can also use an agent to log your logs out to CloudWatch. And it's a fantastic service. But one of the difficulties has always been searching CloudWatch logs. And then at reInvent, they announced CloudWatch Logs Insights, which allows you to basically run queries over your logs pretty simply over a log group. But the problem we all had was, well, if you're running a Lambda fleet, in your application spans multiple Lambdas, you'd have to search each log group at a time, which is kind of a killer. But now they've announced CloudWatch Logs Insights cross-group log group querying. So you literally just select all the log groups you want to search, and then you put your query in. And so, for example, if you're using like an X-ray trace ID or something, you can trace a call throughout your system. So absolutely fantastic. It's been something that a lot of people have been after for a long time, and it's finally here. It's fantastic.
It's definitely something I have been waiting for, because it makes insights a lot more. Actually, it makes it useful in many cases.
Yeah. Now, the reason why there wasn't a serverless slide before is because all these cool announcements are just serverless. See how it's just in there? It's everywhere now. So you don't need to spin up a server for that. Yeah, Rob?
So just to follow up on the Aurora serverless Postgres, it is available in North Virginia, Ohio, Oregon, Ireland, and Tokyo. So no Sydney.
Cool. Yeah.
Oh, one more region than I thought.
You were close.
That's the wrong one. Yeah, a lot of this is definitely worth checking out if you weren't aware of it. The last thing is probably also late last night, the new region in Bahrain, however you pronounce it. Formula One fans probably know better. It's probably not related at all. AWS, a major sponsor of the Formula One, and they suddenly have a region there?
I would suggest it's local laws that probably makes it attractive to AWS as a region. I think it was more surprise than anything else that it just popped up overnight when we've had 12 months lead on a lot of other regions.
They did it because they knew Arjen was preparing the slides for this talk, and they'd just like to keep him on his toes. So I know Andy Jassy is watching Arjen's timetable. It's just...
Always. You can usually see me on the Slack on the day of a meetup complaining that they keep announcing stuff. Anyway, that's it on our side. I think we'll switch over to Guy now.
To Guy. Yeah, it's going to be great. Right, let's set the expectation. Let's get the hype going, everybody. Go grab a drink while we all get set up. Thank you very much. And then we're going to go the low-code road with Node. Say that 5 times fast.
So you're muted over here.
Yep.
Just put this on there.
Yep.
Alright, so just speak normally and I'll adjust it up and
Hello,
down.
hello. 1, 2, 3, testing, testing. Yes, I can hear myself. That's good. I'll resist the temptation to burst into song. Maybe.
Alright,
So I'll just check that everything's still... Yes, lovely. That goes
give me a
in.
few seconds to make sure that the recordings are restarted.
Yep. So that should go in there, hopefully. Actually, water would be great. That's good. Awesome, thank you. Most important things. I'll just check that this is actually working. Just check that my security group's still working. Should be. Let's just wait and see.
Just start your comments whenever you feel like.
I'm going to do that mic thing.
Are you just going to stand there? Like the whole time?
Yeah, the whole time.
Excellent.
You let me know where I'm going to go, because I'm going to big this up.
Don't you dare.
Do you want me to shut one of these windows?
No, the call's good. I'm enjoying it, actually.
Is he enjoying the breeze?
Yeah, I'm enjoying the breeze. Right. So I do have a problem because this is not working at the moment. Right, so just let me. The damn thing, of course, works all the time.
Until the moment you need it, yeah.
Pretty much.
That's pretty much
There we go.
My girlfriend upgraded to this time. So I took my old iPhone back and now it's that one. And I was there open.
There we go. Now we just try this again. There we go. Right, we're all good. So let me just scroll this back up to the top and see what happens if I hit that. Hopefully it's going to go over there. Excellent.
Are you doing live demos?
I am doing a live demo.
Do you want questions throughout or at the end?
At the end, I think, yeah.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen. The next presentation is by Guy Morton now of AC3. He'll be taking us on the low-code road. Damn it, so close with no.
You practiced it and practiced it.
We'll do questions at the end. There's like a warning that comes with this kind of talk. It includes a live demo. So at any point when anything like works or doesn't work, the roof's gonna come off this place with applause, all right? So we're gonna start practice now. So here we go. So Guy, everybody, we're looking forward to your talk. Let's go. That's it, thanks Guy.
Awesome. Thank you. I'll I'll try and make sure. Yeah, you did. You forgot to unmute me. That's right. Hey, woo! The screw-ups are loud and, frequent. Okie dokie, so thanks for coming and giving me this chance to entertain you on one of my pet subjects, which is Node-RED. So really I did this talk because I came up with this title and I thought, well, the title's got alliteration, so it's awesome, and I'll have to just make a presentation to justify saying, go the low-code road with Node. It did screw up a little bit because I had to put the red on the end, but anyway, you get the general idea. So what we're going to talk about here is low code. Does everyone know what low code is? What I mean when I say low code? No? Okay, good. Well, you learned something then. Low code and flow-based programming with Node-RED. How to run Node-RED on AWS for high availability, and some ways you can use Node-RED to do useful things. So what we won't be doing is we won't be opening VS Code, which, yeah, I know, sorry. So about me, I'm a cloud solutions architect at AC3. So I've been working in the web since '94, so I'm very, very old, which is, oh well. I began with Perl, and I always liked the Zen of Perl philosophies, specifically laziness, impatience, and hubris. And these are qualities I've tried to sort of stick to throughout my career. But I like things like there's more than one way to do it. Don't repeat yourself, and do what I mean, which are nice Perl-isms. And low code really fits into that sort of space, because low code's about doing less, writing less code. Low code's about not thinking that all the problems of the world and of your application need to be solved by you. Someone's probably done most of the hard work for you already. Why do it all over again? And there's a very good reason not to do it all over again, because there's 15 bugs per 1,000 lines of code on average. So you really want to try and minimize the amount of code you have to write. As humans, we're pretty terrible at most things, as Chris will attest. Not that he's awesome at most things, but as a species, we're pretty lousy at doing complicated things. So the fewer lines of code you have to write, the fewer bugs you'll end up with. So low code programming is the future, man. So about Node-RED. So Node-RED is a project that started life in IBM. It's basically got 2 core developers who've been working on it all that time. After about a year, they decided to open source it. The essential starting point was that they had hardware and they wanted to be able to collect that data from the hardware. And so Node-RED was initially designed to be installed onto IoT hardware, do MQTT, basically just send the data off the device somewhere else. So that was its origins. These days, it's been taken over by the not taken over, but it's managed now by the OpenJS Foundation. It's Apache 2 licensed, open source, so that basically means you can do what the hell you like with it. So you can package it up and turn it into an application that you brand yourself and sell it as a product that belongs to you. And so you can see there's a number of companies that have already done that. So Particle, if you're familiar with IoT, Particle's a company that has a lot of stuff in that space, and they've used it to make a rules engine. AT&T used it, Nokia, Siemens, Hitachi, Fujitsu. So there's a whole bunch of companies that are taking this technology and basically packaging it up and using it. They see the value in it. It comes pre-installed on a bunch of devices, including the Raspberry Pi, which I have one of here. So essentially the philosophy of it is, I had to use this little illustration because it was so sexy. So flow-based programming is basically, or flow-based applications is where you have a network of black boxes that do things by passing messages from one box to another. And the way you build your application is you take these black boxes and you rearrange them and send messages through them in different ways. And so essentially the model encourages you to write components which are you pump a message in one end, it comes out something comes out the other end, and that's how you build. And the idea of that, of course, is that's very reusable. You can take your nodes and pop them into a new application. They do exactly the same thing in the new application they did in the old application. And you can reconfigure your application quite readily just by dragging a few nodes around. Now, sadly, I'll just show you. So this little animation, it's very sexy, isn't it? So that's apparently what Unity's flow-based environment looks like. This is what the environment in Node-RED looks like. So it's a little bit sad by comparison. It doesn't have any little things just zipping around, showing you live messages traversing the network. Anyway, but it works. So we like that. So it's got a whole bunch of nodes that come sort of pretty much out of the box with it. So you can do all kinds of networking, HTTP, WebSocket, TCP, UDP. You can probably read the list as well as I can, although my eyesight's not that great. But essentially, you can read off hardware, you can do reading off queues, you can connect to databases, you can read the local file system if your Node-RED is installed on a device. And in addition to that, obviously you can create function nodes that do stuff to your data as it traverses your flow. If you find that there's something that you want to do that there's no out-of-the-box node for, it's highly likely that someone's already written a node that does exactly what you want. Because it's based on Node.js, everything's in NPM, and there's, as I say, 2,000 odd nodes that people have invented to do various things, connect to various data sources. So what's it good for? So anything that's sort of event-driven, where you've got like a message appearing and you want to do something to it and then pump something out somewhere else. Obviously, sensor data is the initial use case that it had. So anything where you're collecting data off a sensor and you've got a stream of data coming through, and you want to process that data or go and store it into a database or send it off somewhere or create an alert and all those sorts of things. Building APIs, again, it's a really good use case for it because it's transactional like that, and you've got a data flow, data comes in, do something to it, data goes out the other end. And often it's really good for doing proof of concepts because it's really quick to whip stuff up. So I'm going to do a little demo here of IoT plus MQTT. So basically what I've done is I've got Node-RED running on here, which I'll show you in a sec, hopefully. Demo gods be angry, not angry. I've got an Amazon MQ set up, which is set up to as an MQTT endpoint. I'm publishing data off here to that. It's running in Sydney. Then I've got a Node-RED instance running in Oregon, which is basically just connecting to that source. So, wish me luck. How can I do this right? Ooh, yeah. Nice. Except now I have to look up here. That's really disappointing. Right, so essentially what I've got here is, so you can see these messages coming up the side here. Those are my messages that are coming through. Right, so I'll just give you a little quick tour of the UI. So essentially what you've got down here is like a node palette. So those are all things that you can drag onto your space and start using. And I have this configured I'll just continue the thing. On here you've got a sidebar with debug information popping up, so I can turn that off or whatever. It'll keep coming through. Then these things in the middle are different flows. So each one of these tabs is a separate flow. So you can define multiple flows within it. Yes? Oh, yeah, okay. I can try to do that. Hang on. Oh, it's just going to zoom the middle bit in. That's annoying, isn't it? I'm going to encourage everyone to take it home and play with it anyway, which will get... Yeah, there you go. I could probably make it... The only trouble is I can't really see what I'm doing. Oh, there you go. just not going to cooperate with me there. So essentially what I've done here is I've set up a connector here. So this is the MQTT input node. So that's configured to talk to my Amazon MQ endpoint, which is defined there. And it's got a username and password, users connect to it. And then basically what I'm doing is I'm taking that data and I'm splitting it. So there's a bunch of data coming through from this device. And I'm splitting it up into different types, and I'm sending it through to these output nodes. Now, these output nodes are all for, and this is where it's going to get really hairy, because I'm going to have to try and see what the hell I'm doing. Exit full screen. Right. Excuse me. Where's my mouse gone? This would be much easier if I could see what I was doing. Right. Yes, I'll just leave there. So there's a dashboard which comes as part of Node-RED. So all of those data streams are just basically being fed into this dashboard. And so you can see it's got a bunch of graphs out of the box. So some of those things that are dead, that's actually my Raspberry Pi that's sitting at home, that's gone offline. But the ones that you see are the ones that are coming from here. Now, if you watch the things on the left there, you'll see them change. That's because I'm changing the orientation of this Pi. And also, you'll see if I breathe into this, you'll see the humidity go nuts. Ooh. Ooh. So that's just data that's coming from here. It's publishing to the queue in Sydney, and then the instance in Oregon is just connecting to that queue and pulling the data up. That's that. So in addition to that, and I really wish I could see what I was doing. Let me just see if I can pull this thing back for a moment. Right, just hang on. The other thing, which I'll show you, is this, which is kind of cool. It's not really very meaningful, but it's just cool. So I'll show you this. So the data's coming from here into the Pi, and it's coming straight back out. It's being published through a WebSocket, which this little application's connecting to, and it's just translating that data into a visual representation of the orientation of the device. Pretty cool, huh?
Just a quick question.
Yes.
So this is happening like live right now?
Yes.
As in real life?
Well, you can see me moving it.
Then what I'm not understanding is why this audience aren't going nuts for that.
Thank you. Now I just have to try and get this thing off the screen again. Oh, God. Don't ever get old, people. Don't ever get old. Eyesight's terrible. Okay, so you can install Node-RED on a Raspberry Pi, obviously, as you can see here. Basically, anywhere you can install Node.js, you can install Node-RED. Now, my challenge was, and how am I going for time? Because I just go over and over. Yeah, cool. So the thing I wanted to do, because I really like this tool, and I wanted to see how I could push it, whether how usable it was in a production environment. There are people using it in production, strangely enough. You sort of think, well, how could that possibly be? It's just a tiny little thing that runs on a Pi. How could you use it at scale? But so I wanted to sort of see how hard it would be to actually get it running in a sort of high availability mode. So anyone who's kind of seen an AWS style diagram of a high availability web thing will be familiar with this general gist of this idea. You've got a load balancer, you've got some EC2 instances in each two availability zones, you've got some certificate manager and Route 53 out the front. So that's sort of what I wanted to be able to do. Now, because of the way Node-RED was designed, it stores flows in a local directory. So there's a couple of ways you can do that. So there's storage plugins that you can get, that you can install into it that will let it store flows on S3, which is great. Only trouble is that Node-RED's also just recently introduced Git integration, which is great because it means you can version your flows in the editor. The only trouble with that is it doesn't work on S3, obviously, because S3 is not a block store, and you need block storage to make all the Git magic happen, right? So I've used EFS instead. And surprisingly, it all works remarkably well. Now, has everyone used EFS? Anyone? The people who are wrinkled and haggard looking at the back who've used EFS. Yeah, so for young players, the first time you use EFS, just be aware, every EFS volume that gets created in bursting mode, and bursting mode is awesome if you've got a nice big file system, because the way AWS sorts this out is based on the size of your file system, you get assigned bursting credits, which is basically credits to use the EFS. Now, because this is going to be vanishingly small, because the flows that get stored on it are like 100K, you're going to get 0 bursting credits, and if you were hitting this thing hard, like frequently, you would run out of bursting credits in no time, and then you'd be very sad because your EFS would stop working, and you'd go, why is it not working? And that would be why it wasn't working. So fortunately, in this use case, Node-RED rarely actually reads the file system, so it doesn't matter. You don't need to worry about this. But if you do use it in some other example, like AWS actually sells this as a great way of backing a website, and it's a terrible way of backing a website. But anyway, yeah, if you do want to use something else, just be aware of that. So I set this up using Elastic Beanstalk, which is one of those services which most purist AWS people go, Elastic Beanstalk, why are you using that? I really like Elastic Beanstalk. It's great for this sort of application, which is single tier. It's not very complicated. It's not serverless, and I know therefore Chris doesn't like it. But in my view, it's like server-ish. It's server light. I don't ever see my servers. So as far as I'm concerned, it's server light, server-ish. Essentially, do you like that? Server-ish. So has anyone used Elastic Beanstalk here? Yeah, see, hands go up. There you go. So you're familiar with the idea. So basically there's a bunch of solution stacks that are pre-configured that you can deploy to. One of those is a Node.js stack, and that's what we're using. So yeah, it's neat. Check it out. So there's a few things I had to change to make Node-RED sort of work in this sort of shared environment. So because obviously you want it to be as stateless as you can make it. So anything that was involved in sort of configuring it that you had in the local file system had to go. So fortunately, they've kind of evolved quite a lot, and you don't need to really store very much in the local files anymore. There's only really one exception that I'm aware of. So everything else is moved out of the file system. We're using environment variables to populate config into the app as we need it. And we're using Auth0 instead of hard-coded user credentials, which by default, again, because of its origins, it sort of has that as a model. And then we're using EB extensions. If you've used Elastic Beanstalk, have you used EB extensions? No? Okay, EB extensions are really worth getting to know. So EB extensions are used in this case to configure the proxy, the Nginx proxy, and also to mount the file system. So you can't mount the EFS without EB extensions to basically run as part of the setup process. And also, but out of the box, we're enabling projects, which is the thing that gives you Git. So there's really just 2 parts to this solution, and at the end I've got a pointer to a GitHub repo, so you can download it and have a play yourself. But essentially there's 2 parts to it. So there's a CloudFormation template, which creates the EB environment, and it creates the EFS and relevant security groups and makes all that stuff available. And you can configure it to deploy like a application zip of your choosing. So you could deploy Node-RED to it straight out of the box. I'm not bothering to do that. I'm just running the hello, like if you don't specify one, it'll deploy the hello world Node.js app, which is fine. And then the second part is the Node-RED app itself, which is really 3 files or 3 components. The package.json file, which has all your defined dependencies in it, like all the modules that you're going to install, which includes Node-RED. The settings.js file, which pretty much has not very much in it at all of any substance, and the EB extensions directory, and that's pretty much how it all hangs together. So basically you deploy that bundle of files to EB, and away you go. You're off to the races, as they say. Now, there's one more demo that I'm going to do, which I'm not actually going to bother opening the web browser for, because you've already seen what it looks like, right? But I'm just kind of, this is just another use case, and I'm going to throw my fortunes out there and see if this works. So there's again, as I mentioned, one of the great use cases is for APIs. Has anyone used Twilio before? Yeah, Twilio's awesome. Everyone should use Twilio all the time. Just to make prank calls to people, I don't know. Just you find a reason to use it, it's great. So essentially what I've done with this one is I've built an API for Twilio to talk to just create a very simple IVR. So this IVR should do 2 things. When you ring it the first time, it should say you're a new caller. When you hang up and ring back again, it should say that you've been there before. That's the demo, okay? So I'm going to give you the number. Who wants to waste 10 cents or however much it costs to make a call? Oh, we're all on free mobiles now. Do you want to give it a call and see what happens? Uh-huh.
We did not practice this, I promise. All right, 3. That's a nice number. How did you get that?
Twilio. Just bought it. It costs $2 a month to own a number.
Hello, new person. The menu is about to be heard.
Yeah, that'll do.
Fingers crossed.
Yep.
Oh.
Hello, old pal. Let's go to the menu.
Awesome. So, really useful for building things like that quite quickly. There are irritating things about Elastic Beanstalk, which I don't really... I'm going to leave them in the slide pack, and if you want to look at the slide pack, you can share the irritations later. But there's more nice things than irritating things. Actually, maybe there isn't by count, but you know, generally speaking, the niceness overrides the badness. So definitely, and you know, for those of you who've used EB before, yep, cool. If you haven't used it, have a look at it. It's really cool. Finally, there's this QR code. So I'd encourage you to just download the repo, and you'll find in it there's instructions on how to set this up, and there's the Node-RED build as well. So you can basically it's got a gulp file for building everything, and you can do CI/CD and everything on it too if you want. You can actually deploy it to Elastic Beanstalk using the code in the repository. So give it a go. It's the most fun you can have with your pants on. Thank you. Yeah.
Anybody got any questions?
Make them simple ones if you've got them, because don't want to be challenged.
Cool talk. You mentioned step functions sort of could be used as a later stage, like this is good for the POC. Is there any orchestration capability within it?
Within Node-RED?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
No.
So could that be glued together somehow, or you just wouldn't recommend doing that?
I sort of saw that more as an alternative if you wanted to go sort of fully AWS native services to do a similar sort of job. I mean, step functions is the sort of orchestration tool for Lambda, in the same way that Node-RED is kind of using the flows, is orchestrating your components in that world. The nice thing about it, of course, is that, which I didn't show you, but all of the functions, it's all JavaScript, right? So if you write a function node, it's JavaScript, it's pure JavaScript, it's pure node JavaScript in reality. So you can pull in node packages and use them natively inside a function. So you can basically, what you write there, you could turn into a Lambda function really easily, just copy and paste the code out, do a little tweak here and there, and away you go. You've got the same thing as a native AWS function. And then you just need some way of orchestrating to basically do the messaging part of it, which is where I imagine step functions would I haven't actually used step functions, but I know you have. Yeah.
Okay, so the state, like it's not carrying any state, or that gets written to disk?
Sorry?
Or this state?
It's a good question. So Node-RED does have some, it has like a flow context, and then it's got like a global context. So the global context is initialized when you boot up Node-RED. And then each execution of a flow has a flow context. So you can carry state from node to node through your flow, which is similar to what you have in step functions.
Gotcha.
Yeah. It's all the same shit, right? It's all the same. These ideas aren't, AWS didn't invent them, and neither did these guys. So, it's all, yeah.
Cool, thanks.
Any other questions? Okay.
So, what format does it use to store the files for the flows? Is it YAML, JSON?
That's a really good question. I really so want to say YAML, but it's not. It's JSON. Yeah, no, it's JSON.
Okay. Is it easy to version control it and Git or?
Yeah, so it's got inbuilt. So if you take that project and spawn it yourself, you'll see it's got Git out of the box. Like the sidebar I showed you that's got the debugging in it. It's also got a Git sidebar. And you can like clone a repository as a project. They call it as a project, and essentially you'll clone whatever flow file is in that. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for the live demo. Can you run Node-RED on serverless?
That's a really good question. Apparently, yes. No, you can. I just don't know how. I just don't know how sensible it is. I think sort of doing a cold start of it, you're loading a lot of modules that may make it not cost effective. But if you just search GitHub, someone has done a Node-RED serverless. I thought I told you about that. Yeah. So basically, what happens with that is you run the editor locally, and then it is configured using that S3 storage plugin to save the files to S3. And then it's also created a Lambda function that also reads from S3. So it reads the flows from S3. So when you call that Lambda function, it goes and gets the flows from S3 that you've created locally. So you don't have an editor. It's just got an API gateway endpoint basically in front of it. And if all you want to do is API, is like an API flow, it's conceivably a good use case. But I would check what the sort of runtime execution time looks like before I stood behind it and said that's a great idea. It's definitely something you can do, but it may not be the best thing to do. Thanks.
As always, test it first.
Yeah. Your mileage may vary, may contain traces of nuts. Yep. All good?
Thank you very much, Guy.
No worries. Do you need your thing back? Okay.
The next segment is Marketplace, yep.
Yes. So, who's hiring? Is anybody hiring? Give me some hands. There's a couple of hands. Yes. So just if you are looking for work, we won't ask you to out yourself here in case your boss is watching or sitting next to you. Or I love it. I make that joke every week, every month, and you guys still laugh. But yeah, just.
Hey everyone. So I work at Latitude Financial. So Latitude Financial, they're probably better known for the 28 Degrees credit card and sales finance products at JB Hi-Fi, Apple, Harvey Norman. So there is a bit of a brand exercise going on soon, just because people don't know the brand very well. We're the third biggest personal loan provider in Australia.
Don't you have ads with Alec Baldwin in them?
We used to until he was ditched. Yeah. So I think he punched too many people. So. Yeah, we need a lot of people who are passionate about AWS and want to learn or are really good across a whole bunch of teams. So there's a digital capability forming, API and systems. Cloud and SRE is the capability I lead. So we basically have a platform and we help folks use that through AWS, built on a whole bunch of different SaaS tooling. So if you're interested in Python, Go, Scala, interesting problems to solve, come and have a chat and I can direct you to folks who might want to chat with you. Awesome.
Hello everyone, Hamid from Enabler. Latitude is a great company. If you don't end up going there for whatever reason, come to talk to us. We're always looking for really good engineers, cloud DevOps, and API devs to join the team. Lots of opportunities online. Look on the website enabler.com.au. Thank you.
Was there anyone else? No? Don't forget we do have a jobs channel on Slack as well. So if you are in the market or you're looking to hire, hit that up. We will take a 15-minute break or so. There are still some drinks left, a few drinks left. All right, maybe we make it a 10-minute break. So just a quick 10-minute break. If you're interested in either of those two roles, go chat to the guys. We're back in about 10 minutes.
This problem, it's probably because your AWS is not being used that seriously. If you're working in a large organization, in enterprises, financial institutions like Latitude or banks, ANZs and NABs of the world, you definitely have run into this problem. And I've personally been on both sides of the table. I've been as an engineer, I've worked in environments where I couldn't do things that I needed to do, and somehow a magical access key and secret key comes up that allows you to do that, and we use that. And And I've also been on the other side of the table. I've been the person who implemented these restrictions, not because we didn't trust people, just because that was the right thing to do. So when you work in a world where there we go. You have these two polar opposite forces where you have security requirements, regulatory requirements, where you have to, very common requirement is always, segregation of duties and least privilege implementations. And at the same time, you have delivery requirements where you live in worlds where people want to have agile deliveries and do DevOps and all of that good stuff. These two don't really, though, go that well together. The good thing is, when it comes to AWS, nowadays it is possible. It is possible to actually have these two, at least for least privilege requirements. And a lot of the engineers and developers that I work with, they actually want to comply with it. But it's always, when you work under pressure, when you have deadlines, things that need to happen, that's where people start making mistakes and tripping. Release engineering principle, one of the mentioned principles in the SRE book is always been self-service model. And one of the very common tasks that platform engineers or developers want to do in AWS is to create service roles, IAM roles, where you define what your service can do when it comes to doing things in AWS. If you have a Lambda function or an EC2 instance that can do certain things, you really want to have that limited. If you have an EC2 instance that can read from, let's say, a parameter store, you want to give it access to a very specific key, and you want to give it read-only access. You don't want it to do anything more with that key. Or let's say you want to give your Lambda very specific access to a very specific table. So how can you do this? How can you give people the power of creating roles and dealing with IAM without being able to circumvent what you have put in place? That kind of defeats the purpose. If you have access to IAM, you might as well just give yourself admin access or just get out of the shell and do what you need to do. So before we go too much in detail in terms of how we can solve that problem, let's talk about IAM, and let's find out how a policy evaluation logic is performed at AWS. So whenever a request is made, there are 4 things happen with that request. The first step is authentication. AWS, when it receives a request, it's either from the CLI or from the console, API call, what have you. The 4 steps that it happens to perform whatever task that request is asking. The first step is authentication. It makes sure that your username, password is correct, your access key secret is correct. Very simple. The second part, it processes the request context. It tries to figure out what is it that you're asking. It tries to identify the action that you want to perform, the resource that you want to perform that action upon, the principle of that request, your user or role or a federated user, what have you. Environment information about that request. This includes IP address, where the request is coming from, the user agent. Sometimes you can make requests with the JavaScript SDK from a web browser. It will have your user agent. Whether that request was done with SSL, I recently found out that there are AWS API endpoints that operate on HTTP, and as well as HTTPS. So this is one of those things. It's mind-blowing, but it's there. So if you really don't like that HTTP endpoint, there's an environment, not an environment variable, but it is environment data within that request that you can use in the condition. And it also has information about, excuse me, the resource data. And that includes
the object that you're trying to interact with, the dynamic information about that object, the DynamoDB table or a tag, that kind of stuff. The third step is evaluating policies. After AWS figures out those two previous steps, it moves on to evaluating the policies. It looks on any policy in the AWS account that you're interacting with, and it tries to find any explicit denies. It looks at your identity-based policies. These are policies that you attach to IAM entities, roles, users, groups. Resource-based policies, S3 bucket policies is a really good example of that. Permission boundaries, organization service control policies. These are policies that you impose on an account within an organization, which means you can enable or disable access to specific at service level. So you can, let's say you have an account that doesn't need to have EC2 for whatever reason. You can disable access to EC2 for that account for good. And session policies. The fourth step is a little bit more detailed. So this is the flow chart of AWS. This is the logic behind the scenes. So this is where AWS decides whether you should be able to do something or should not be able to do that. So it tries to determine whether you can, whether an action is allowed or if it's denied. So when you create IAM policies, you can specify an effect. You can say whether a statement is allowed or if it's denied. There's a third one. Does anyone know what that third one is? It's not mentioned. If you don't mention it, it's implicitly denied. So you can explicitly allow something, explicitly deny something, or not specified. And when you don't specify it, it's implicitly denied. And if you have a service that's implicitly accepts things, then you really need to look elsewhere. So starting from the right-hand side, it's to my right, to your left, the very first thing that AWS does, looks at all the policies and then tries to figure out if there is any explicit denies. As soon as there is one explicit deny in any of the policies that relates to your request, that request is denied right there. Otherwise, moves on to service control policies. That has higher priority compared to the other policies. If your SCP in that account explicitly denies the request, your request is denied. Moving on to the next one, resource-based policies. S3 bucket explicitly allows access to that bucket. It's allowed. It's a final decision. And the rest of the conditions are not really checked. So let's say that S3 bucket that we use as an example, that's also denied, as in implicitly denied. Moves on to the next step, IAM permission boundaries. IAM permission boundaries are a set of IAM policy statements that tell AWS what permissions can be applied or not applied. So very similar to IAM, identity-based policies, a policy that you attach to your role or user. But there's a catch to it, and I get to that. Then moves on to the session policies, and last but not least, identity-based policies. So a lot of times when policies are created, they are put on IAM identity entities. However, you will see that they have the lowest priority in this flowchart. All right, so going back to the original problem, out of the 6 or 5 policy types that we talked about, there are 3 that we are interested in. One of them is optional, but I would recommend it, and that's SCPs. Service control policies where you define what services can be accessed or not. on an AWS account, they're useful. So we're going to use that. We're going to use permission boundaries, and we're going to use identity-based policies. That flowchart that we talked about, it can be summarized in this Venn diagram. The effective permission that you have to perform a task is only the actions that overlap between the three policy types. So in order to be able to do something, your service control policy should allow it, your permission boundary should allow it, and your identity policy should also allow it. And that's it. That's all you really need to be able to give IAM users access to manage IAM. But there's a little trick to this. So how do you do this? How do you make sure there is no way to circumvent this? The catch with permission boundaries is permission boundaries act as I think they have a really good suitable name. They allow you to create whatever policy that you want and attach it to your IAM identities, but you will not be able to get out of what your permission boundary allows. So you can create an identity policy that gives you entire access to the world. It doesn't matter because your permission boundary is going to block that. The catch to this is a little small code. I'm going to show you a little bit zoomed in version of this. But imagine this is your policy statement. And I'm using this just for demonstration purposes. There is no way this is any good. But there is a condition. There's a condition clause here that basically says, in this, anyone who has this condition, this policy, this permissions boundary attached to their identity can not do anything with IAM. So there's an explicit deny, but there's a condition. The condition is that you cannot do anything with relation to IAM unless you have a permission boundary set. So it creates a situation where you can create roles, you can do whatever you need to do, but you're forced to attach a permission boundary, and that allows you to create service roles or be very confident that developers can create service roles and create policies and whatnot. And you will always be sure that you have this permission boundary attached. So that little trick, it's not that documented that well in the AWS documentation. You will find it, it's there. But I think this is beautiful. It allows you to give freedom to people to manage IAM, create roles, do whatever they need, without actually being able to circumvent it. So that's pretty much it. This is the basis of implementing this process. So I know. So I've been doing this on a project that I'm working on in the past few months, and it's been very effective, and it's pretty much seamless. And a lot of people don't really see any difference using that apart from being able to actually do what they need to do. So I guess with that, we do a little bit of a demo. So demo is a little bit, it's not a live demo, so it's not going to fail. But I think it's the most anti-climactic demo in the history of this event. Access denied. So when you try to create an IAM role, if you don't specify the permission boundary, when you create IAM roles in the console, you can easily, you will see there's an option for permission boundaries, but it's one of those things you actually have to click on it and it collapses, and then you can see the rest of the form, and then you select it. I'm not sure why they haven't made it so visible. And it also has a warning. It says, this is a very advanced feature. If you use it, be sure what you're doing, but it's actually not that complicated. All it wants is you attach a permission boundary and you're free to do whatever you need to do. And the this is the demo. And as soon as you attach a boundary, it just works. However, this means you really need solid policy definitions. Your permissions boundary, you cannot take that lightly. You actually have to spend a lot of time and think about what you want and what you don't want and how you're going to structure that policy. Some of the questions that I found very useful to define this is these questions. So what are the things that you really care about and what are the things that you really need to restrict? You know, if there's something you don't really need to restrict or you don't care about, your organization doesn't care about, you know, just let it be. Then have a think about how you can exploit that policy. If you're putting out permission boundaries, there are tons and tons and tons of it's enormous number of actions within IAM that you actually need to review one by one, and you have to make sure there is no way to circumvent this, because there are ways to circumvent it if you're not very careful with this policy. And it's usually not the policies that you're restricting, it's the policies that you forgot to restrict. The next question is, how do we roll this out with minimum impact? If you have already IAM users all over the place, if you have been operating in AWS for a long time, this is going to be very challenging. So you also need to think about how this is going to be hopefully seamless, and no one's going to realize how that's going to be, that this has been implemented, but at the same time, everyone's been enabled to do this. And you also need to communicate this. This model is not something that, I'm working with very smart people on a daily basis, and the communication is very important because not everyone has heard about this. And another thing that also will really help with your policy definition is coming up with naming conventions. For example, even though everything I said means that you can interact with roles as long as you have this policy attached. Maybe there are roles that you actually don't want people to fiddle with, like the infrastructure admin, for example, that kind of roles. So having a naming convention, for example, anything that starts with admin or whatever, you want to deny. Bless you. Another tool that I found very, very useful is Policy Simulator. Has anyone had any experience using the Policy Simulator at AWS? It's a very, very useful tool. It's amazing. I think it's very, very hidden. I don't know why, but they buried it. It's not easy to find. You actually have to Google it to find it, or go to IAM and you will find it somewhere in the dungeons. But it's a very useful tool. The API reference in AWS, this is something that used to be lacking. I mentioned there are a ton of actions and permissions that you, and namespaces. Nowadays with AWS releasing, 10 new services every day, that's just getting out of hand. But the documentation now is really, really good. So when you look for documentation, look for the API reference. And it gives you a very detailed, low-level documentation about what things you can and you cannot do with AWS. And you will be surprised what are the things that you can do with AWS. And then we get to SCPs. SCPs also have their own policy editor. That's very useful if you want a source of truth, what AWS services are available that you want to review. That's a really good place to start. And you'll also notice that there are a lot of AWS services that have changed names. Alexa for Business used to be called Alexa for Business, like literally. Now it's called A4B and number 4. This is a little demo. I mean, well, it's not a demo, it's just a screenshot of the policy editor. You define your policies and you review what are the things that you are actually allowing or you're denying, because it's beautiful, because that policy that I showed you, that it was very tiny, that's just the beginner, that's just a structure where you want to start with. But it's going to get really complicated, and you want to make sure that there's, what you've defining is very tight. This is a really good place to test your policies, and it shows you what things can actually allow. This shows the final decision based on your explicit denies and your explicit allows and your implicit denies. So this is just that it. And the other thing is monitor what you've implemented. You can spend a lot of time on this and get it to work, but at the same time have a close look on it. There are 3 services that you can use, and I recommend to you to use. The first one is CloudTrail. CloudTrail checks for any out-of-character activities in your account. So if you have restricted a certain activity and all of a sudden someone does it, it notifies you. You cannot really rely on it, but it's a good place to start. And you can also, because it's collecting all of the interactions with the APIs, the AWS APIs, you can also use that information. You can, you can find out what's been performed that the policy was supposed to block. And if you find anything, that means someone circumvented it. And then you can go and review why that's happened. And one of the other things that I did is, I asked my team to go and find ways to circumvent the policy. The next one is guard duty. Sorry, yes, I talked about the out of character. This is guard duty that does that. CloudTrail only collects the information. Guard duty does the analysis. And then you have config. And config is very useful in this space. The reason for that is config looks at your current configuration and it gives you a report, and you can create custom rules for the reports that you care about. For example, I mentioned if you have a lot of AWS accounts and a lot of roles, one of the things you can do is you create a config rule that goes and checks for permission boundaries and finds any roles that doesn't have permission boundaries and tells you about it. So you can do 2 things from there. You can either go and say, okay, this role doesn't need a permission boundary because it's a special role, like AWS break glass admin, or or you can decide to have auto remediation. So if you're trying to roll it out, one of the good ways of doing that is saying, okay, what are the roles that don't have permission boundaries? Create a config role that finds them, and then define auto remediation that goes and attaches that permission boundary. And with this, what's going to happen is people are going to create lots of roles and lots of policies, and your AWS account is going to be a mess. So another config rule that can be very useful is finding any policies that have been created that haven't been used for the 30 years and just doing a report on it. So say you can use this to find any orphaned policies or roles or what have you. Pitfalls. Things to look out for when it comes to boundary policies. Make sure you deny changes to the boundary policy, because if people can go and modify the boundary policy because you allowed them to modify IAM, they can just go and remove whatever condition you had in there. So make sure you do that. Make sure this only applies to service roles, not user or governance roles. If you have engineer roles or whatever, make sure those roles cannot be edited, otherwise, again, can be circumvented. Avoid explicit allows in the boundary. I've noticed that the documentation, the example that AWS has in the documentation, it has explicit allows. I think it's very confusing, and I don't think it adds much. I have a feeling whoever did that, they didn't understand it. Maybe I'm being a little bit cocky, but avoid doing that. I think it just makes things much more simpler to understand. The other thing is that use managed policies, which means AWS keeps track of your AWS policy changes, so it keeps revision of your policies. You can go back and forth if you need. If you roll out a new policy that's going to break things, you can easily roll back. Although CloudFormation does that pretty well anyway. So, and the other thing is that 6,144 character limit on the policy, so you cannot have more than characters. So it's pretty much 6 kilobytes, and that's without spaces and line breaks. So you're very limited, and this is why I recommended service control policies, because if you want to, deny anyone to mess with direct connect in an account, like no one really needs to do anything with direct connect. If you want to deny that, just put it in the SCP. So SCP kind of gives you a little bit more room, a wiggle room, and it makes your permissions boundary a little bit more easier and nicer to manage. And I think there was something else I wanted to say about that. Oh yeah, the other thing you can do with service control policies nowadays is that you can put region restrictions. So, you know, if you don't want anyone to operate in any region other than Sydney, for whatever reason, regulatory requirements usually, SCPs are a really good place to do that. You couldn't do that in the past, but now you can, so there's no reason not to use them. But just be very careful with your global endpoints, because if you restrict everything to Sydney, then you cannot log into your AWS account because IAM is global. Yeah, I learned it the hard way. And the other thing is that permission boundaries cannot be attached to groups, which is mind-blowing. I don't know why. I don't think you should deal with users, IAM users anyway, just have everything federated. But if you really need to have that, if you need to have your users, Amazon has, you know, the best practices, and it says never attach policies to IAM roles, attach them to the group, and the user inherits it from the group. But for whatever reason, it doesn't support groups, so you cannot do that anyway. So there's a little bit of contradiction there. So yeah, it's just something to be aware of. And then SCPs. SCPs are blacklists, or not whitelists. You cannot tell them deny everything apart from the services that we want. You can only say what services you don't want. So if Amazon releases a new service that you don't know about and it does something dodgy, you better go and block it. And yeah, I talked about the global endpoints. That's it. I hope that made sense. I don't think it did, but All good? Well, thanks everyone.